Right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Chatham House Global Forum on Forest Governance 2020, the latest in a series of meetings that started back in 2002. We are now about to start panel 1, the session on international trade and its role in leveraging forest sector reform. As you can see on the slide in front of you, we have 4 speakers lined up. I'm going to be chairing it. My name is Duncan Brack. I'm an associate researcher at Chatham House, and I've worked on issues around trade and environment and forest governance and forest policy for quite a while now. Now, just some housekeeping notes to start with. The event is taking place on the record. We're not under Chatham House rules. It's being recorded and it'll be available on Chatham House website later on, and it's also being live streamed at the moment. There's simultaneous interpretation available between English, French, Spanish, and Portuguese. You should see an interpretation button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So if you just click on that, you can select the language you need. There was also a separate app available called Attendify, which you will have been told about via email. That's a way for you to see more information about the participants, and you can chat to each other and you can send messages to the panelists who will hopefully have a chance to get back to you later, but we're not using the chat function on Zoom during the session itself. We would very much like you to pose questions to any or all of the panelists though, and you can do that using the Q&A button, which you'll see also at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And audience members are very welcome to tweet using the hashtag #CHForests. We're certainly welcome that kind of interaction. Right, so we have 4 panelists lined up, as I said. I'm going to go through them one by one and then ask all of them. We should have plenty of time, I hope, for questions and answers from the audience. So without further ado, let me introduce our first panelist, Marianne Katunen from the Institute for European Environmental Policy. Marianne.
Hello, and good afternoon for everybody, or good afternoon from the UK. Thank you for the introductions and thank you for the invitation to join the panel. So I'm going to kick off. As you can maybe see from my affiliation, I come from an institute that works primarily in the European context, in the EU context, looking at the EU's role in the world. So obviously, of course, with that background, I'll be talking about the Europe, EU, and the EU as a trader in the global context. So obviously, EU is only one trader in the global scene, but there are, I think, 2 reasons why to focus on the EU, and also why my interventions hopefully are interesting also for the international audience as well, no matter where you come from. The first reason is that EU is one of the world's largest uniform traders, because basically being part of the EU means that you're part of the rules that trade with a similar premise that are negotiated by the European Commission. So basically a big block of countries trading with similar rules. EU has 85 trade agreements in place. It has over 45 in negotiation. So it's one of the most prominent negotiators in the world scene. 80 countries in the world have EU as the largest export market for them, which basically means 40% of all the countries in the world mostly direct their export to the EU. EU is particularly the largest market for the world's least developed countries to export to, which means that EU is also supporting economic development in the world through that type of trade relationship with the developing countries. And in terms of the trade volume, EU's member states account for 16% of the world's imports and exports. So what these statistics tell you is that EU has a significant influence to set the standards for trade also in the global level. So that's one of the reasons why EU is important. Then the second reason why EU is interesting and important is that with the EU Green Deal that has been recently approved and published, but also even before, EU has been one of the key world traders that has been championing sustainable trade, at least on paper, as part of this policy. And the EU trade policy explicitly considers trade as a vehicle for supporting sustainable development, especially in developing countries. So that's on paper. And now, of course, you're going to be looking into that claim a bit further. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask the question as to what we can learn from EU trade policy globally, both in good and bad. And I have picked up 4 lessons that we can learn and we can discuss in the EU context. So my first lesson to start with is that in general, the EU, even though it has sustainability as part of its trade policy, it can and it should do better. So we did a recent review looking at EU's trade policy and how it delivers, and we came to the conclusion that there is not yet a net positive contribution of the EU's trade to sustainable development. Obviously, EU supports a lot of the economic development in its trade partner countries to trade, but environmental and social contributions are lacking. And not even necessarily lacking, but actually EU has a negative impact on ecosystems and environments elsewhere, including forest ecosystems. So, for example, the Sustainable Development Solutions Network publishes a global SDG review annually. And in its past 3-year reviews, the latest that came out a couple of weeks ago, it always highlights that OECD countries, including the EU and EU countries, have a negative environmental impact on third countries through trade. So basically what this says is that we might be protecting our forests and our ecosystems here in the EU, but through trade, we are responsible for deforestation elsewhere. So there's clear evidence on that, and that evidence is there consecutively already through quite a number of years. And EU's own studies and impact assessments don't disagree with this. EU fully acknowledges that expansion of agriculture is key cause for deforestation around the world, and trade is a key player in this expansion. And EU's trade particularly is a key driver in this. So there are these certain global commodities traded in a global market that are associated with deforestation, which I'm sure my fellow panelists will tell you more about, including soy, palm oil, and beef. And EU is basically one of the key responsible traders for these kind of commodities in the global market. So that was my first lesson. There's clear evidence that EU can do better, even though it has instruments already in place to address sustainability of trade, including in the forestry sector and with the forest ecosystems. My second lesson now then looks into more details as to what and how can EU do better. And the second lesson is that we would need to do better in terms of having information on deforestation and its impacts to underpin EU trade agreements. So basically the information that supports the trade agreements to be put in place. So EU has a dedicated process underpinning trade agreements, looking at their impacts. So EU has these sustainability impact assessments placed since 1999. And globally, kudos to the EU. The system and the sustainability impact assessments are one of the most comprehensive and transparent ones around the world. But we have looked into this rather recently through a number of projects, and we have concluded that ecosystems and biodiversity impacts are not as rigorously covered in these EU sustainable impact assessments as they should be. And in particular, there is very limited quantitative analysis linking the changes in trade flows to land use changes, to forest cover changes, and then also onwards to changes in terms of biodiversity, ecosystem services, and also associated social impacts. So basically, what I'm saying here is that EU framework supporting the trade agreements could do better in terms of information and looking at the impacts of trade liberalization to forest ecosystems and also biodiversity and related impacts. There are 2 current bottlenecks for doing this. One is simply that a generic guidance on how to do these impact assessments is lacking, and also they are not a standard methodology on how to do so. This is a very fast-moving field, so developments are taking place, and also EU is paying attention to this particular space in the future. So I think hopefully this will improve. But at the moment, there is still room for that improvement to happen. And also one key bottleneck, in addition to the guidance that is lacking, is that there also doesn't seem to be enough resources to carry out more rigorous assessments. So obviously, sustainability impact assessments are a big scope of work within which only certain element goes to looking at these type of ecosystem impacts. And of course, to do a good piece of work, enough resources would need to be given to those people who do this kind of work to be able to provide the information to the level required. So basically, we can do better with the underpinning information, and for that, we need better guidance as to how to do so, more standard methodology, and also appropriate resources to carry it forward. That was my second lesson. My third lesson is that we also do need better safeguards to be in place in those trade agreements themselves, and the EU is one of the examples of that. So EU's trade agreements since 2009 have a dedicated chapter on sustainable development, so-called Trade and Sustainable Development chapter. And in the recently concluded or ongoing negotiations, this applies to countries like Vietnam, obviously Mercosur, Indonesia, Philippines, and some negotiations that are on hold like Malaysia and Thailand. And all of these contexts, as we know, forestry is a key sector as that is part of the trade agreements. So what this means is that there is a sustainability element, part of the trade agreements by the EU, that covers also forestry. And overall, all the agreements seem to be similarly covering this space, promoting trade in legal and sustainable forest products, promoting cooperation initiatives on forest conservation, sustainable forest management, and combating illegal logging. But that's kind of where all those agreements then stay. So they don't state more specifically what to do with it or what kind of control mechanisms or verification of origin they should be in place. So far as we could see, the EU Andean agreement is the only agreement of the recent agreements that includes control mechanisms and verification of product origin regarding timber. So it could therefore be considered as one of the most kind of gold standards at the moment in terms of EU trade agreements. So that's something about the trade agreements themselves and what the trade agreements say about forestry. And also what's important in the trade agreement space is that the monitoring process to implement these trade agreements should be improved. So at the moment, there is not strong enough mechanism to monitor in compliance of forest sustainability or sustainability more generically, and also mechanisms to bring forward and settle disputes in the context of EU trade agreements. There's a consultation mechanism, there's a panel of experts, but there is no financial penalties for incompliance in the sustainability space in the EU trade agreements. And obviously that leaves the trade agreement slightly toothless in this context. So those are my couple of lessons from the EU. And then, of course, if we then move on to asking, well, building on the above, it will be very interesting to see what EU could do with the trade policy context next. So the EU Green Deal gives a strong mandate for greening trade in the EU. It includes a number of really concrete initiatives for the EU. So it foresees better implementation of the EU trade agreements through Chief Trade Enforcement Officer, whose task would be to monitor and enforce third countries' commitments on this trade and sustainability space. So let's see whether that Chief Trade Enforcement Officer can work some miracles in terms of implementing the provisions that are in place. The EU has also promised that it will improve the impact assessments underpinning the FTAs, free trade agreements, both ex ante but also ex post, which will be interesting because obviously a lot of EU agreements are already in place. And then thirdly, and most importantly, the EU has promised that it will, in next year, put forward a legislative proposal and other measures that will avoid or minimize placing of products associated with deforestation on the EU market. And also, this will help to promote forest-friendly imports and value chains. It's still unclear what kind of mechanism this will be, but they have promised something legislative, which actually bodes well, I think, for increasing sustainability. But also a number of experts have pointed out that it will be really about the definitions and the base year against which you measure this sustainability that will be the key to make this initiative happen. So that's sort of, what EU does at the moment, and also where EU is going in the future. Key recommendations for the EU would obviously be to improve agriculture and forest-related provisions of FTAs, make sure that the criteria for the implementation of deforestation-free products will work and we get it right in the future. And also we should really improve the mechanism that underpins those trade agreements in terms of providing information on what the impacts are foreseen to be, or what the impacts we have witnessed during the implementation of the FTAs. But with that food for thought, I think I stayed pretty much within my remit of allotted speaking time. I'm going to hand over back to you, Duncan.
Thank you very much indeed, Marianne. Yes, perfectly on time and an excellent introduction to what this session is about. So without further ado, I'll go on to our second speaker and welcome Perrine Fournier from the NGO Fern.
Hi. So yeah, my name is Perrine and I work for the NGO Fern. We monitor EU policies impacting forest and forest people's rights. We have different work areas. We work on a climate policy, sustainable consumption, and of course, trade policy. Fern used to work on the trade policy in the past and then stopped for some strategic reason. And recently we decided to monitor again this policy because of ongoing negotiations with forested countries like Indonesia, Mercosur countries, which include Brazil, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Argentina, among others. And why? Because we feel that these free trade agreement negotiations with forested countries could undermine EU commitments to protect forest, as well as trading partners' commitment to protect forest. As you know, we import a lot of forestry commodities, and there is a growing number of evidence showing that increased trade is likely to increase deforestation. And as Marianne said, the current provisions in free trade agreements are not strong enough to mitigate our negative impacts. So we have been looking at the Mercosur, at the agreement recently concluded between the EU and Mercosur countries. You may have heard a lot about it because it was highly covered in the media, and even recently. So we also received the news that we have submitted a complaint to the European Ombudsman, highlighting the fact that the European Union hadn't concluded the sustainability impact assessment prior to the end of the negotiations, which means that the negotiations have not been properly informed by rigorous sustainability impact assessment. And the Ombudsman on last Thursday said our complaint was admissible, so she will now look into how the Commission should have properly handled the file. So, and it's a second, if the Commission again is criticized for its behavior, I mean, it could be maladministration. It would be the second time, because for Vietnam, the Commission already had been accused of maladministration because they had concluded the trade agreement without finalizing a human rights impact assessment. So it raised the question also of the Commission accountability, because they have a handbook. It is required by EU law to carry out such assessments, and they don't do it. And so that's one thing I wanted to complete on what Marianne was saying. So, and we also want to look at to monitor this free trade agreement negotiation to see also to what extent trade policy could learn from the VPA flagged processes, both in terms of commitments and in terms of processes, because in the free trade agreement negotiations, the civil society organizations are not part of the negotiation process, while in VPA process, as you know, it's a multi-stakeholder process which requires input from various stakeholders to achieve a compromise on what should be legal timber. Of course, we are well aware that these free trade negotiations are cover many topics, and so it would be very challenging to have a multi-stakeholder process around these trade negotiations. Nevertheless, I think it's also the right of EU citizens and civil society across borders to have a say in the way our governments negotiate trade deals, which may have very high impacts on our society. So we on the Mercosur, we have had a lot of contacts with the Commission to highlight potential negative impact of this deal on forest. So some may say that deforestation was happening before because soy is exported to the EU already duty-free, as you may know. And some people will also say that the EU consumes only a small part of beef coming from Brazil, so our impact could not be that big, but we argue that it's really a missed opportunity that we have not used this trade agreements as a way to regulate this trade for a better future. And it shows again that the hard core of the EU trade policy remains gaining market access for companies to get raw materials and agricultural commodity at a very low price, and also cut off the non-tariff barriers also for companies to be competitive abroad. And sustainability issues are only mentioned in this trade and sustainable development chapter, which is not subjected to the general dispute settlement mechanism. So it shows again that the EU wants to promote its values, wants to make trade more sustainable, but they could do better, like Marianne said earlier. What I wanted to say more. Yes, in terms also of implementation, civil society organizations could have a role to play in so-called domestic advisory groups that are set up once the FTA is concluded, but there is no clear role and function for civil society organizations. We don't know whether it's for to give advices or to monitor the implementation. If there is a breach of these commitments, then what to do? There is a precedent with the FTA between the EU and South Korea, where there has been a lot of complaint on labor issues, and it has taken a very long time for the Commission to do something, despite letters from trade unions, etc. So now the Commission has decided to act. So they are well aware that people are complaining about the lack of triggering mechanism, the lack of clear of procedural rights even. So what are the procedural rights of third parties to make these commitments implementable and monitorable? So that's a key question that needs to be solved. And so we EU Indonesia, well, we could say the same concerns, but there is more room, we think, to make something better. First, because Indonesia has put forward some proposals where they want to use trade and sustainability development chapter in a way that may support them. So there are a lot of issues that are being discussed with the EU, but there is more room for improvement there. We hope so, and we also need to highlight that some member states are really demanding for more concrete actions on trade and sustainability development. So France and the Netherlands have recently released a proposal which is quite interesting, and they suggest to link preferential access to the EU market to commitment to sustainability effort. So we really have to monitor this, I think, because in the future we may see more improvement. So we have some hope for EU trade policy to be better. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Perrine, and thank you for staying well within time. Just remind people that you can use the Q&A function, the button at the bottom of your screen, to submit questions. Don't feel you need to wait until all the 4 speakers have gone before doing so. We want to have a look at what the questions coming in are and see if we can group them or structure them in a way that will help the discussion. You'll also see beneath each question a little thumbs up symbol. So if you like the question and you think it ought to be asked, if you click on that, it'll upvote it, and we'll pay attention to what you're voting for. Right, let's move on to our 3rd speaker, who is Paolo Cerruti from CIFOR, the Centre for International Forestry Research. Paolo.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'll make use of a presentation for a while, just to give you a brief background on what I'll be talking about. This is specifically focusing on what both Marianne and Perrine already mentioned. So the EUTR related to the FLEGT and VPA, so forest law and governance, forest law enforcement, governance and trade, and the voluntary partnership agreements that the Commission negotiate with timber producing countries. I'm speaking about this topic because we conducted a recent impact assessment, if you want, of the VPAs, specifically in a few countries. And I will be speaking about what we have learned with a view to the lessons that future trade agreement could take on board, depending on what we have learned for 20 years, almost 15 years of negotiations with the VPA. So this background that you see here, it's just to give you an idea. We covered about 4 large thematic areas, which are sustainable forest management, forest condition, formal and informal forest sector, which are very relevant in most producing timber countries. And then we covered jobs, employment, and governance. You see a lot of overlap. I just used the colors to show that, because basically we selected various indicators, and not every indicator is clearly linked to one single area. They can cover multiple areas. And then what you see there also in the graphs are 3 lines. So the dotted line is before the VPA negotiation, and the line that doesn't have any dot, so the continuous line, is after. It was a before and after assessment. And the gray line is the contribution that the VPA made to that movement of the indicator. So what you see in the arrow, for example, is that the situation for that particular indicator went up on a scale from 0 to 5 that you see on the vertical axis. In some other cases, you've seen that some indicators were not very well developed at the beginning of the negotiation. They didn't move a lot over the X number of years that the negotiation lasted. And in some others, they were a bit better in the beginning of the process, in what you would call the baseline, as Marianne said, and it didn't move anyway. So it stays at a certain level. This is just to give you an idea of what I will be talking about and why I'll be using this type of graphs. They are coming from this assessment. So I won't focus on the methodology or nothing, just a couple of points on the lessons with regards to the trade. That is the topic of this session. And so just to go back to that one, we also asked one specific question, triangulated through various indicators, that show that the trade element in the VPA agreements was a very important one. So countries are very well aware, are made very well aware while they go through the negotiation, that their involvement, their agreements give the country considerable positive messages and helps in the international trade that they will tackle with the VPA. So as you know, the VPA works in tandem with the EUTR, the timber regulation of the EU. And so the two of them are kind of the same, two different coins, two different sides of the same coin. And it's very important that countries recognize that they do this, of course, for their own improvement of the sector, but also because there is an international trade dimension to it. And so one of the first lessons that I'd like to highlight is that normally when you negotiate these agreements, one of the initial rules, if you want, from the European Union was there should not be any blueprint, and that's okay as a way of proceeding, because countries, as we found, you see there the red arrow, for instance, on one single indicator, they are very different points in time when you tackle that specific issue. And so it's very important that you not use blueprint like each country is at the same point, because that is not where they are. Different countries are at different points in time. The reverse side of this is that in practice, you need to consider that these should not lead then later on in the process to discrimination. Because if you go for an improvement, say, of one particular sector, governance or sustainable forest management, and then 10 years down the line, you do not consider that you started from very different starting point, and that's why the baselines are important, then you might want to say, okay, listen, we are 10 years into the process. I see that, say, Indonesia is much better than, say, Cameroon, just as two examples. So I stop importing from Cameroon and I keep doing with Indonesia. And that's kind of problematic. So it could be a lesson for other agreements that still focus on international trade. The second one is that certainly there is an avenue of improvement from a zero level to a better level, and you see that level of improvement through of course baseline and contribution. But you should not forget that sometimes you are so focused on negotiating your own trade agreement that outside there you forget that there are also other forces that push on the reverse side. And this is very it came out very clearly, specifically with the timber trade across the past 20 years, because when it started, I can show you the example here, when it started with the VPA negotiation and the FLEGT action plan in 2004, you had the European Union that was just important of tropical wood products. And across the negotiation time or the engagement time with different countries, you see where the orange line is today. And that's much below what it was 10 years ago. So you are negotiating something with a strong entry point energy here, but then you end up 10 years down the line with a completely different set of fundamental characteristics, I would say, trade. And when you look at this, that's the lesson I think here important, is that of course this will happen with most commodities, more or less. But what I've put here on the graph is where along the timeline different other blocks or countries or traders or consumer and producer came into the game in terms of their own pieces of legislation. So while you contribute with your own single action plan like the EU, you also need to play the game outside of the box and bring in people or constituencies outside. So you see the Lacey Act in 2008, and then Australia with the Timber Bill, and then Japan, South Korea, and China, as we heard this morning, is the last one that is arrived, changed the law last year. Still all the regulations are needed, but you need to play also that game, not only focusing on your, without forgetting that there are others that can go with the red arrow towards against what you are doing. So that's, I think it's also one important, and here I focus, you see very clearly the international, but I would like to remind that there are also national coalitions on which you can play. You know, you have a country where, for example, you have a strong soy board or a cocoa board or a beef board, whatever. But those are not international, they are in the national level, and they still compete for the same surface, forest. And so you can also use those coalitions to play along your trade negotiations. And the last point that I wanted to talk to is it's always, at the end of the day, a lot of it is about where you spend your money and where you invest your money. And that's why I also go along the line very much of Marianne and Perrine in terms of, do we need a lot of more better information on what impact we are having towards during our negotiations, and when they are concluded, follow up after? Because sometimes it's not a question of I have a lot of money and I can invest in everything. I'm having an impact somewhere. What do I do when I recognize and I have a feedback loop into my own system that tells me that I am having an impact? So here I'm using just the area where normally we had the indicators on forest conditions, sustainable forest management. I'm having a big impact there, say a positive one, and now my money is reduced or the number of countries is increased. And so with a single pot of money, what do I do? Do I leave that area because it's going on very well along without my help, and I move somewhere else where I might have a negative or not so positive impact as of yet? Say corruption, when you see that big triangle going in, or informal SMEs that are not as good as industrial logging concession, and I move. So this is speaking, I think, more to the need for continuous monitoring, verification, and follow-up, and then inclusion of feedback loops to the policymakers that then centrally have to take decisions on what to do next. And I think this, the same when you look at the trade numbers of any other commodity, you say oil or cocoa or other things. And so you need to, the key point is that you need also to seek alliances, because in some cases you are not the only one focusing on that set of indicators. And so you might want to discuss with other processes that are exactly trying to do the same, and you move on to another one. It's a better use of resources and no overlap. Again, one of these theme, I will just click very quickly on the last one. For me, a theory of change is something that is very useful. There are certainly various tools on how you can do this, but I think that the EC has learned a lot over the last 15 years on how to get those feedback loops and those monitoring system within the agreement, the trade, the agreement of the VPAs, and so this is just to show you where those little boxes will go, so that policymakers in Brussels can have a loop and say, oh, I'm doing good here along my impact pathway, or I'm doing not so good, so I might move to another one. With that, I am done. Thanks a lot. And I should stop sharing the screen. How do I do that? Let me see. Stop share. Okay. Oh, thanks. Somebody has stopped me from.
We have people to do that for you. Thank you very much indeed, Paolo. It's excellent run through of quite important points about voluntary partnership agreements and their relation to trade and forest governance. Okay, so let's move on to our final speaker, and then we'll open it to the floor for questions and answers, and have a few for myself. Our final speaker is Roberto Vac from the Brazilian Coalition on Climate, Forests and Agriculture, and also the Hoffman Center here at Chatham House. Roberto.
Hi, good morning. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak about one of my favorite subjects. Well, the Brazilian Coalition on Climate, Forest and Agriculture was created precisely to deal with land use and climate. It was basically created to help well, the Brazilian society and Brazilian government to perform in Paris during the COP. Basically, it's an advocacy organization, and tropical forest is one of the areas which the coalition deals with. Basically, tropical forest countries have a very poor governance systems. The institutional environment is very fragile. Well, there's a discussion about if there is a cause effect on poor governance and tropical forests, but that's another subject that we could deal in another discussion. Basically, we deal with a very heterogenic environment, very ambiguous, very volatile, politically influenced. The illegality is something very complex and sophisticated, frequently dealing with corruption of local officials, frequently associated to local oligarchies with the highest political power in the regions. And presently, illegality very much connected to gold mining, narco traffic, land grabbing, all kinds of illegalities. So the question I have is, what is the meaning of the legality concept? In Brazil, for instance, it's very easy to transform illegality to legality. So you can easily transform an illegally originated product into a formally legal product. So how to go beyond legality, how to deal with the false legal products basically on a very sophisticated corruption processes involving local government. It's much more difficult to compete with a false legal product compared to a completely illegal product. So there is a perverse effect, a trap associated to the legality concept. So the point is how to go beyond legality. We, in our view, traceability is the only alternative. How can include traceability in the legality process, considering that traceability will challenge the efficiency of the local governance systems. So in fact, when you try to solve the illegality, you need to put your finger in the local governance and local institutional environment, which is frequently very difficult to deal with in the international agreements. Traceability requires a deep dive into local situation, and as it was already said, demands interaction with civil society organizations. And the situation we are living in Brazil, for instance, it's clearly that government is definitely not aligned with civil society initiatives. So how to face this type of situation? So the importance of third-party certification schemes, it's very much it can be a very important alternative, can be a solution, can be a way to go. So the question is how to match, how to link this type of agreement with third-party certification schemes like FSE or others. So how to include this type of initiatives into the agreement is not something that easy. They are from different natures, government, local civil society, and international certification schemes. Of course, also the improvement of technology can be of great importance. Digital, satellite, blockchain, etc., should be part of this new trade agreements as a monitoring system. And a point that for me it's of huge relevance is the perverse effect of restrictions and bans. Once you have a trade agreement with a certain part of the world, you leave the alternative of, let's say, less sophisticated market as the only option. Also, the reputational effect over regions. For instance, Amazon, the ban of Amazon is generally spread all over on all products and initiatives and investments. So Amazon is an area where investors just don't go. It's not a place for, let's say, people involved with sustainability and this type of thing. So you have a perverse effect on this type of restrictions and bans. So you need to consider how to, at the same time that you deal with this type of agreements, how to include the invisible communities that are normally captured by illegal agents as the only alternative of income they have. So a ban or let's say restrictions or reputational damage at the end cause a huge negative impact on local communities, poor people that are not in the, let's say, formal society. So how to add this type of elements into the international agreements, controlling somehow the leaking effect of this type of initiative, considering that the only alternative will be the markets that are not into, let's say, this legality framework. So to finalize, my point is how to include flexibility into international agreements. We are definitely talking about a wicked problem. So problems that we don't have a clear problem definition, the involvement of the societies, very complex, very volatile. We have ambiguity all the time. So flexibility is of major importance. So how to not anchor the agreements only in the government, as Paul already mentioned, how to definitely and formalize also the role of civil society into this type of agreements. Of a major importance also is subnational situations, how to go beyond federal government and involve regions. So can we consider let's say on a deeper quality the involvement of subnational situations, and also how to be more to have a better link on the agreements with financial strategy and the role of financial institutions on the enforcement of law and governance in the different regions. And finally, the huge importance of communication, how to involve the whole society, considering normally that you have three different types of groups. One that is against the solution, so that plays a very intense informal veto power. The example of timber is very clear on that. In many cases, you have part of the society which is informed and have a pro, let's say it's a pro solution brought by the agreement, but normally they don't have enough political power. But the majority of the society is completely indifferent from this type of agreements, and how can we have the, let's say, the indifferent part of the society more involved on this type of agreements. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Roberto. And that concludes our presentations. For those who are interested in seeing Paolo's PowerPoint slides in more detail, we will make them available either via Attendify or the Chatham House website after this session. So we've got plenty of Q&A, plenty of questions coming in, and not all of them are strictly speaking relevant to this session. We are dealing with international trade agreements here. I think some of them might fit better in the next two sessions, where we're looking at demand side regulation tomorrow and transparency later in the week. But we'll try and get through as many as possible. So I want to start with a few questions on free trade agreements, EU free trade agreements. And I want Marianne, could you say that of the free trade agreements that have trade and sustainable development chapters in them, is there any evidence so far they've had any impact?
Thanks, Duncan. And that's a very, very, very good question. I would say that at the moment, jury is still out. And I think it's partly because indeed we could do better in terms of, what we have in those trade agreements, and also particularly, the process that we are using now to implement them. But to give the trade agreements and EU some benefit of the doubt, obviously, it's now a decade of implementation. I think, in the space of trade and in the space of policy, 10 years is not the longest of time. So that's basically what we have at the moment. And I think, therefore, what I would rather start now look forward to is to see how we can make sure we will get more and better information on how the trade agreements are working into the future. So at the moment, I would say, jury is still out. I haven't seen something massively convincing saying, yes, EU trade agreement has had a really, really good, particularly in the environment space, which I follow. So, maybe the human rights space might be slightly different. But in the environment space, I would say, EU trade agreement has made a big difference in terms of how sustainability how sustainability is implemented and how sustainability provisions are implemented. But that is the FTAs, though. What I would say, and this is basically what the fellow panelists have then said, is about those flanking measures, as I would call them, which are not specifically trade policy, so not FTA or trade agreement, but they are these other regulations which have standards that EU then abides to. And that's basically about the FLEGT and the EU timber regulation, which has been there for much longer time, and for which I think we can see, but that's my colleagues are basically more well placed to answer. There we can see that EU actually has had, the EU regulation has had a positive impact in terms of increased sustainability. I think that's basically what Paolo's slides were speaking to, that it has, the VPNs have had an impact. And I guess what I would like to say to conclude is that we should indeed be looking at the FTA's trade agreements and what they do and how impactful they are, but we should be looking at them along the side of the other regulation that flank them. And it's kind of the whole package that then will work, and the whole package we also will want to be making to work, not only the FTAs.
Yeah, thanks very much. I want to come on to VPAs and a few questions around them in a little while. I should say, if any other panelists want to come in, feel free. But I also wanted to ask, just while they're thinking about that, on free trade agreements, looking beyond the trade and sustainable development provisions in them, are there provisions in the FTAs for their suspension in case of non-compliance with some condition or other on the part of one or other of the parties? Sort of general question about how you make sure that the agreements you reach in free trade agreements are actually followed.
Is it also for me? Maybe.
Yeah, sorry.
My fellow panelists.
Sorry,
yeah.
Maria.
No. So your question was about the enforcement mechanisms in FTAs in general, free trade agreements in general. Yeah. So what I mentioned, also what Perrin mentioned, was that in the sustainable development space, so with the sustainable development chapter, we have a mechanism, but we feel that mechanism is rather toothless. But in the FTAs, they more generically, they have a better mechanism, or more, forceful mechanism, which is about a dispute settlement, and which actually then can lead to sanctions if not enforced. And that's kind of one of those dichotomies that we've been pointing to as well, is that why is sustainable development chapter and sustainable development space regulated, implemented, enforced in a different space than the rest of the trade? Shouldn't it be fair that they would actually be following the similar kind of process and also being both subject to sanctions if there is non-compliance? Yeah, so far, we haven't seen in the EU context EU nudging in that direction, or nodding to that direction. But of course, that's an interesting way to keep asking at least a question towards the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, it's important if we're talking about stricter trade and sustainable development provisions. What's the enforcement mechanism? What's the compliance? Okay, I have another. Thank you, Marianne. I have another sort of free trade agreement question aimed at Roberto in particular, from Jonathan Zeitlin. Given the current stance of the Bolsonaro government towards forest legality and deforestation, what are the prospects for bringing international pressure to bear via Brazilian agribusiness? For example, through fear of reputational damage or loss of market access. So that could be via a free trade agreement, or it could be by sort of less formal means of exercising pressure, perhaps from the private sector or from investors. Roberto.
Well, thank you for the question. Considering the present Brazilian situation, I would say both are of major importance. I think that the international society must have a very attentive look on what's happening in Brazil in terms of the deforestation and let's say the the dismantling of the monitoring tools that Brazilian governments are using. So yes, pressure is of major importance. However, in my view, pressure is not enough to deal with, like I mentioned, the poor people, the people that are somehow captured by the illegality that has no other alternative. So in certain way, pressure also causes a perverse effect on putting those people more and more in the hands of the illegal players. In my view, we need to go beyond pressure. We need to talk about solutions, talk about how, for instance, the chain coordinators, the big traders, they can, at the same time, they put pressure on the local companies, they get involved with the local companies to try to include those that are at the moment in the hands of the opportunistic agents and the illegal players. So it's a combination of, in my view, a combination of pressure with really to have a deep dive into the local situation and try to solve solutions for those that are excluded.
Okay, thanks very much. So a question for Perrine, or I should say following up on something that Perrine said from Ewan Grant. Based on Perrine's point about the EU free trade agreement with Vietnam not considering human rights issues, Ewan's interested in why that is. And is that because of the sort of general lack of human rights provisions and lack of due process of law in Vietnam? Perrine, do you want to have a go?
So yeah, thank you for the question. So it was because before entering into negotiations with Vietnam or other ASEAN countries, the EU started negotiating a free trade agreement with ASEAN as a bloc. And by that time, it was in 2009, if I remember correctly, the EU did a sustainability impact assessment, and said that then they didn't have to do it again because it had already been done. Sorry, and that's it. But it means that the Commission was also saying that the way they were carrying out sustainability impact assessment by that time did include ways to assess the impacts on human rights, which has been highly criticized by human rights NGOs because the methodology was not adequate to really investigate potential human rights impact. And following the Ombudsman decision, the EU of the Commission reviewed its methodology to try to address a bit more the potential human rights impact, but it's still criticized by human rights specialists.
Great, thanks very much. Okay, I have another question for you, Perrine, again on something that you mentioned. It's jumping up and down on my screen. Just going to find it. There we are. You mentioned the positive proposals Indonesia was making to use the TSG chapter of the agreements being negotiated with the EU to support its efforts to fight deforestation and improve forest governance. Could you say a little bit more about what those efforts are?
So yeah, maybe positive is too optimistic word, but at least they provide some room for dialogue. So the Indonesia proposed to get recognition for ISPO, you know, their mandatory a certification scheme for palm oil, which of course cannot be accepted by the EU. The EU cannot accept a certification scheme like this, but at least if the Commission or the EU were willing to do better with its trade policy, they could consider Indonesia demand and explore to what extent they could use the trade agreement and the preferential access they could offer to their markets to to support Indonesia to improve ISPO. So we are well aware that NGOs Indonesia, for example, there is a coalition involved in ISPO, and they have been making a lot of demands which have not been considered. They are also concerned about the lack of transparency in this process. And if we compare with the VPA process, for example, then why DigiTrade does not use this trade agreement negotiations to invite Indonesia to have a more multi-stakeholder process to discuss how to improve ISPO and how to provide incentives to raise ISPO standards. So that's why we say it's an interesting proposal.
That's great. Thanks very much indeed. Another question on free trade agreements, I think for Marianne from Karima Baka. Could the EU request a revision of the environmental chapter or the trade and sustainable development chapter in FTAs that are currently in force?
That's a really good question. And I was kind of looking at it on the Q&A panel and thinking, oh, I don't actually have a clear answer to that, even though it's such a self-evident question. But I think it's basically because we haven't really looked into that. At least I haven't, because it hasn't been an issue. But I think, and I kind of hope that, when we move into the future, and if EU is serious about its Green Deal promises, this, might be at least a question more frequently to be asked. So what I promise is I will look into that. I'll have a clear answer in the future. But what I can say now is that what happens at the moment, the current practice is that obviously trade agreements are reviewed from time and time again. So we are now in the process of starting to review the Andean Agreement, which includes Peru and Chile and I think Colombia. And I think Mexico is also in a similar process. So obviously that is a window of opportunity to then look specifically into the Trade and Sustainable Development chapter and update and improve it. But then obviously the question becomes, what triggers this type of, renewal of a trade agreement or update of a trade agreement? Is it a sort of, that, both trade partner countries feel that, yes, it might be time to, update this trade agreement, so let's reopen the negotiations? Or is there something that triggers it more specifically? And particularly in the environment and trade and sustainability space, is there something that could trigger such a review? I'm not aware of something as such. Maybe fellow panelists might be, but that's certainly something that, we and I will be looking in the future as well, because that's an obvious question as to how to improve the existing trade agreements, whether we can actually get into the chapter itself and try to, suggest opening it up, or whether we need to sort of, work with the implementation. Having said that though, working in policy, any context, opening up existing instruments is always difficult. It takes time. So that's why we tend to also, try to work in the implementation space and also with other instruments that, blank trade agreements, because this, is realistically sometimes more feasible.
Thanks very much, Marianne. Does any of the other panelists want to come in on any of these points about free trade agreements? No, we're okay. All right, then let's move. Well, you have a chance to come back at the end. Let's move on to a few questions about the voluntary partnership agreements, the VPAs. Paolo, perhaps I could come to you first. How important do you think the trade element, the licensing system and the timber legality assurance system and the export licensing system, were they to the VPAs? Do you think we could have had VPAs in force without that kind of element? And obviously the question is relevant to forest risk commodities. People are talking about perhaps using the VPA model for some commodities, particularly cocoa. Do you think a VPA for a forest risk commodity ought to mirror that element of the timber VPAs? Should it have the trade element and the licensing element?
Well, I think in the beginning it was very, very important. I mean, I remember when in the beginning, when any country engaged into that, the main argument among the group of negotiators was that there would be a trade premium, if you want, coming with the discussion. One caveat with that, one word of what we learned, is that I think if we were going to use that in the future for other agreements, I would do it in a much better way, in the sense that we need to be more aware or to make our own assessment of what actually some scenarios or scenario could be. Is it a promise that I'm making a partner country that can be a reliable promise or not. You know, in the beginning, I felt that it was more like, let's sign the VPA because we can certainly use the market and promise these premium prices. It was kind of the same argument that then private certification had. But then we all know that this never really materialized as of yet, at least. So you need to play on different topics. And I have to say that we should look at how we frame those discussions in the beginning, because some of the countries had very clear messages of frustration, you know, raise expectations that do not materialize in the end when you're done all the road. And in that case, it can cause a lot of frictions once you are in that key implementation stage where actually you don't deliver that premium, and a country might feel kind of tricked into the agreement.
Thanks, that's great. Perrine, do you want to come in at all on this one?
Yeah, no, I just I agree with what Paolo said, because we can see also in the existing, the current negotiation between Indonesia and the EU on the free trade agreement, that Indonesia has asked, for example, to be compensated in case of false advertisement on its certified palm oil, etc. And they are also very frustrated about flag VPA, saying that they put a lot of effort to improve timber supply chain, and they see that China is exporting a lot to the EU, and so they feel frustrated that other countries keep exporting to the EU without having done this sustainability or legality effort.
Sure, thanks very much. Okay, another question on VPAs for probably either of you. From Felix Hoogveld, the VPA process appears to be a very lengthy one. How could it be made simpler and smoother? Paolo, do you want to have a go?
It's a very complex. If you really go through the whole process.
I think we've lost you, Paolo. Would you mind cutting your video?
While we're waiting for Paolo to come back, hopefully he will. It's the perils of online conferences. Perrine, do you want to comment on that question about how the VPA process could be made simpler and smoother?
This is a very, very difficult question, because if they become too simple, then people may argue that the standards are not then high enough. I wouldn't have a simple answer to that. Well, we heard so from our experiences that the traceability system and the technologies are very demanding for producer countries. So maybe there could be some room for improvement there. But in terms, for example, of the negotiations on the timber legality, I don't know how this could become simpler. We need this deliberative process, and we need this time to get a compromise on what should be legal timber. So yeah.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Yeah.
I think
May I jump into that?
please do, Roberto. Yeah.
No, my point is that we need to address flexibility as part of this process, and it's a learning process. In my view, if you want it to be perfect since the beginning, you never get it. So my point on that is it should start as a suboptimal, and then as you learn, as you face the different situations in different environments, then you improve. So instead of completely rational where you have everything completely included since the beginning, in my view, it should be faster, more flexible, and adaptive as an adaptative type of agreement.
Yeah, thanks very much. I mean, I think it is inevitably, Yeah, the whole basis of the VPA is supposed to be getting at some of the root drivers, the root causes of illegal logging and deforestation, dealing with quite complex issues of governance and law enforcement, and trying to open up decision making to a multi-stakeholder process. You know, you can't do any of this very quickly. It's inevitably going to be difficult. But yeah, whether there are ways to speed it up or deal with it just sort of stage by stage rather than trying to reach everything at once is a good question. Paolo, it's good to see you back.
Sorry, sorry. Well, just I guess because I heard the last term as part of Roberto, one element just I want to focus on is that during along the process, you also discover that there are things that you didn't consider initially. So one of the big issues that came out with during the VPA negotiation is the domestic market, SMEs, etc. I don't think in the beginning there was a knowledge about exactly what they represented in terms of trade, in terms of other topics. And those, of course, you can take decisions that you can use step by step. Once you take them on board, you decide what you want to do, but you still keep on going with the old decision that you have already taken. So yes, that's one thing to speed up. Also, because one of the big problems that you see now in many partner countries is that kind of fatigue. You know, there are different other topics that are hitting the political agenda, and you don't want to lose momentum when you can have it. Then you move off to the next topic.
Thanks very much indeed. Now, some more general questions here. We have one from Cindy Squires about traceability. And of course, if you're kind of certainly a traceability mechanism underlies the VPAs, you have to be able to trace the movement of timber through the supply chain, and that would be true for any similar agreement for forest risk commodities. So Cindy asked, have any of the presenters considered the costs associated with traceability and how these costs and procedures may push SMEs in particular without the ability to implement them out of high value product manufacturing and thus out of high value economic development? Who would like to go first on that?
Maybe I can.
Please.
I think the concept of costs associated to externalities is a wrong concept. Basically, externalities should be included in all costs of all products. So if you put, let's say, the costs to trace externalities only on the traceability system, in my view, this is not the right way to go. Products should be traceable in everything, not only, for instance, in deforestation, in all kinds of externalities. This should be part of the cost structure of the products. If you don't have that, the cost will be paid by someone else. So this is the concept of true cost, true price, all that. So I have some problems to get into the discussion that traceability adds costs. In my view, the traceability of all externalities should be part of the cost structure of every product.
Okay, thank you. Marianne?
Approaching it from a slightly different angle than Roberto. Not actually disputing what you said, Roberto. I think that's kind of rings through to me. But what I was thinking and what I deal with is policy coherence here in this space. And what we've often are highlighting is that what you do in a trade space or in a space of setting standards, you should, particularly in the context of developing countries, complement by support that then allows the developing country sectors to adapt to the standards that, for example, the EU is setting. And the policy coherence comes into place, and for example, looking at the trade policies and perhaps, for example, the standards that we put in place, were it in the forestry sector, it could be also in the circular economy sector, as I'm looking at as well at the moment, and how those then should be complemented by the EU's development cooperation policy. So basically, that then the development cooperation policy that supports development cooperation generically in the trade partner countries would then look at the specific sectors, look at how they can be lifted without leaving the SMEs behind to be able to match the standards. And I believe that that is kind of what the timber regulation and the FLECT is already doing. So they kind of are doing this double play with this EU regulation and also EU development cooperation supporting the implementation in the third party country. And I think they are, as far as I've read, some positive examples of that policy coherence actually working and being in place as well. But, you know, colleagues, I'm sure, know better of this.
Thanks very much, Marianne. Anybody else want to come in on that? Okay, so we have a follow-up question to Paolo about what we were just talking about, the trade incentive in VPAs, from Freddie Polo. What is the main incentive for countries to continue with the FLEGT VPA process if they're not getting any kind of premium, any kind of price reward in the market?
Well, that's the way, what they say is that there's still a hope that this will materialize, but also because the scope of the agreements is very broad, and they do see some improvements even without having. So at the moment, for example, you only have Indonesia that is shipping FLEGT timber. The others have been implementing for many years, and they do see advantages and positive outcomes already, without even entering into the discussion of premium markets. They are streamlining the sector. They are having a lot of, if you talk to the Ghanaian government, they are very, maybe at least what they say, they're very happy that civil society has taken up a stronger role in terms of how they go about policy making, how they go about transparency of information, these kind of things. So voila, I don't think you necessarily need that premium price for people to realize, even in partner countries, that things are improving for the better, sorry. And so I would say that to Freddie.
Okay, that's great. Thanks very much indeed, Paolo. Now we have quite a specific question from Sihirul Fitra. I'll just see if any of you know enough about the situation to comment on it. It's about the export of merbau outside Indonesia. I think Sihirul is not completely clear whether it's going to the EU or not. But this followed an Indonesian NGO and media investigation, and apparently the illegal logging involved certified companies, and it could have involved corruption. But the EU doesn't seem to be making any effort to explore the case. So does that bring into doubt anything about the FLEGT mechanism, or is it a problem that's kind of outside the scope for the EU to do anything about? So I don't know if any of you know enough about this case to be able to comment on it. No. Okay, sorry, Sihirul. We will see if we can find someone who can answer that, but I'm afraid this panel can't, and is slightly outside the remit of kind of international. Well, no, it's relevant to how VPAs are implemented. So I have a specific question to Roberto then. So we're going back and forth between Indonesia and Brazil. From Maria De Filippo. How do you see the Amazon Council's role in law enforcement for deforestation violations? Do you think it could help reduce illegal deforestation?
Yes, I think so. Part of let's say the role on controlling deforestation, of course, is in the hands of government, especially monitoring tools, controlling, and also putting an eye on everything that's happening in the forest area. So yes, government has a very important role, but not only the government. In my view, the connection with the coordinator of the chains is part of the solution. The monitoring tool should be as also added to all the actions related to transportation of commodities, the local transportation, the local market. So it's a combination of actions, very complex, but in my view, yes, the Amazon Council can play a role if interacts with civil society and the private sector players. If it stands alone, no, I don't think it will be effective.
Thanks very much. Okay, we're beginning to come to an end. I'm just going to ask a couple more questions, and then I'll give the panelists a chance to say any final comments they'd like to make. So the next one's from Scott Hajost. The EU has a whistleblower directive, and the US has strong whistleblower rewards and protection laws, such as the Lacey Act, the False Claims and Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, with international scope. Could any of the panelists comment on the role of whistleblowers in combating the illegal timber trade and forest corruption and assisting law enforcement? And again, it's going slightly outside the remit of this session. But if any of you have any any answers to that question, now is your chance. No.
Well,
Paolo.
in my views of
Roberto
major, not just to say that's of major importance. Local whistleblower, especially involvement of local communities in this process.
Great, thank you. Paolo, any comment? Okay. Marianne.
Yeah, I'm just thinking that, this panel has been also very good in terms of getting some thoughts and ideas for future work and where to look into. So obviously I haven't made this connection before, but, when looking into then, how to better implement the trade agreements and then what else is out there that can support that better implementation, this is some avenue to be looked into. So all I can say is, I will certainly consider this as to, whether the role it can play in the future and in the EU context and, what kind of recommendations one can perhaps build around that.
That's great, thanks very much. A question to Paolo from Marshall Adams. Just interested in what you were talking about in the FLEGT theory of change. But he's saying the theory of change is not being publicly available. I mean, that's kind of your, as I understood it, what you presented is your formulation of it. It's not a kind of official theory of change that underlies the process.
There were a couple of evaluation of the action plan around 2015, 2016. One was specifically mentioning the fact that the EU had lacked a coherent way of following the process, and I guess it's coming out of those suggestions and recommendations that now the European Union does have an official theory of change. We are working on it. That's why I just showed that very briefly, and it's proving, I believe, it's my personal opinion, it's proving a very useful tool in how you go about seeing where you are having an impact, going down the right way that you want to have, or you need to some change along the way so that you can actually hit the target of your impacts, your long-term impacts.
That's great, thanks. And of course, there is a fitness check of the FLEGT regulation and the EU timber regulation just starting at the moment, so impact assessment being carried out. And there'll be by DG Environment in the European Commission, and there'll be a consultation process starting quite soon on that, with results expected at some point next year. Okay, final question from, and I said I'll give you just a couple of minutes each to make any concluding remarks. Jonathan Zeitlin, coming back to the VPA's point, as a way to speed up VPAs and make them more effective, there seem to have been innovations in terms of mechanisms for monitoring, review and follow-up of implementation, for example, through joint stock takes, forward planners and annual action plans. In Vietnam, a multi-year joint implementation framework has been developed in advance of ratification of the agreement itself. Do the panelists think that these methods can help to overcome some of the slow progress and delays experienced by the VPA pioneers, such as Ghana, Indonesia, and Cameroon? Perrine, I can see you nodding there.
I don't know if it can help. I can just comment on what's happening in Vietnam, because I'm monitoring a bit more closely the VPA process there. This multi-stakeholder group has been more than welcome, because civil society organizations were not part of the formal negotiation process of the VPA. And so that's where, so you can see that VPA has been has allowed for improvement there in Vietnam, because now civil society organizations are really part of the implementation process. Whether it will make VPA process easier. The thing is that when you look at what's happening in Vietnam, it's that this group is in place, and at the same time, Vietnam is still going under its legal reform by implementing the TLAS into its domestic legislations, and so far the drafts they have presented are still very weak. So in that sense, we cannot say it helps to be more effective.
Yeah, thanks very much. Paolo, any comments?
It's just that, yes, I believe they can. There's always a tension between what you put on paper and then what teeth do you have to bite on that paper, and we have seen that across several countries. So the instrument itself can help, but then you also need to be embedded into that system, a way of saying, okay, now it's not working this way, what do we do? Do we stop? Do we go ahead with other options, etc.? That has been a bit lacking, I think.
Great, thanks very much. Okay, just 4 minutes left, so give a chance to the panelists for any final comments. What we were trying to get at in this session was looking at the role of trade as a lever of forest sector reform, mainly through formal structures like free trade agreements or voluntary partnership agreements. So any final comments? Let's start with Marianne.
Well, my first comment is simply to say thank you for, Duncan, for the good moderation, and my fellow panelists for things that I've heard and learned, and also actually, the audience I've learned and I had through the thoughts. So it's been very enjoyable. So thank you for that. My final comment or thought would simply be to call the timber trade community, which I think, there's a big part of this call, to stay really vigilant now that then we move into the future with the EU and looking at that broader EU initiative on deforestation-free trade, because I think there's a lot that can be learned from how the timber regulation and FLEGT has been implemented, which should then be brought into the discussions and basically build that mechanism better from the start with the lessons learned with the timber side. So that's my call for the community and for the end of the call. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed. Perrine.
Well, thank you as well for providing me this opportunity to take part in this panel. And just to add to what Marianne was saying, I want to make aware the participant that there is a trade policy review, which is with consultations up until mid-September. And so we are, I invite people to submit contributions to review our EU trade policy and make it more sustainable for forests. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Paolo.
I would like to conclude and say that this is a process, so people should not expect that the day you sign something, everything works perfectly. It takes time, and there are evidences that things keep improving. So I would like to stress the fact that although we are living in a world that they all say will not be the same after this kind of pandemic things, I would like to see countries losing what they have already gained up to the day because of some new something that will come. And we have seen that a little bit with Indonesia and that kind of removal of SVLK recently. Then they went back to their decision. I'm very happy that they went back to the decision, but you see that you feel that the policy tensions might go down. So I would hope that we don't lose what we have already gained up to this day, and then we move on to something improved. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you very much, Paolo. And Roberto, the final word.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just to reinforce the importance of all that as a process, a flexible process, a learning process. I think this is part of the society is developing. In my view, again, traceability is the name of the game, and I would not expect anything related to premium price. I would say that this process leads to access to market, leads to access to better financial situation, but not specifically price. But thank you very much. Great.
Thank you, Roberto. And thank you all. So sorry for those people who post questions that we didn't have time to answer. You'll have seen Melissa's comment in the chat that we will try and answer them all through a Google document afterwards. Actually, some of them, for example, there's one question on due diligence, which we didn't have a chance to come to. Probably it fits better in tomorrow's session on demand side regulations. That's Tuesday the 14th at 11 o'clock British Summer Time. And there are a few questions about traceability that I think probably might fit into the session on Wednesday on transparency in the forest and land use sector. And then we have the final session of this forum on Friday on emerging and radical ideas for forests, which could cover anything at all. So I hope you are able to log into some or all of those, and I hope you've enjoyed today's session. Thank you very much to the panelists, and thank you to you all.